What's up, guys? Asian here again with another Greymoor sneak peek discussion video, and today we're going to be discussing the viability of spellsword builds in Greymoor, assuming that these pre-Greymoor changes on the PTS right now do carry over to the Greymoor chapter. So, first of all, let's do a couple of definitions here first. What exactly is a spellsword? Spellsword is a term that's used fairly commonly in RPGs to describe somebody that uses martial weapons or martial skills along with magical skills. So a traditional sort of spellsword would be something like, if you guys are familiar with Dungeons and Dragons, the Eldritch Knight subclass for fighters. They use martial weapons, usually something like a longsword and a shield or something, but they're also able to cast spells. That would be your kind of stereotypical sort of spell sword, so to speak. Now, in Elder Scrolls, the Elder Scrolls lore, spell swords are actually fairly common. For example, in Skyrim, you can you can dual wield magic with a one-handed weapon. In Oblivion, spellsword, I believe, was one of the pre-built classes when you first created a character. So the idea of making a spellsword is not entirely unfeasible in the Elder Scrolls universe. It's actually something that a lot of players who played the single-player Elder Scrolls game have done a lot. It's a very popular build for a lot of people. Now, in Elder Scrolls Online, as an MMO, there are some limitations to making a spellsword in this sort of setting, mainly because of the way that skills and your weapon attacks end up working out. So one of the big changes that sort of made spellswords potentially viable in Greymoor is the fact that now light attacks and heavy attacks scale off of your highest offensive stat. Now, on the live server right now, any attacks that are made with martial weapons, so those would be things like daggers, battle axes, longswords, those all scale off of your, if we go ahead and look at our character sheet here, those scale off of your max stamina and your weapon damage. So if I were to use swords right now on live with this particular setup here, I would not be doing a lot of damage because my weapon damage and my max stamina is low. Now, with the pre-Greymoor PTS changes, light attacks and heavy attacks scale off of our highest offensive stat. That means if I were to use a dual wield build right now, instead of running off of weapon damage and max stamina like it does on live, it would actually scale off of our max magicka and spell damage instead. However, that doesn't change the damage type of these weapons. So martial weapons still deal physical damage compared to a lightning stab, which deals shock damage, a flame stab that deals fire damage, and so on and so forth. So you are still going to be limited if you decide to run martial weapons as a Magicka DPS, your typical spell sword. That's mainly because your CP setups are more geared towards magical damage. So this is your typical Magicka setup, CP setup here. You have Spell Erosion, which is spell pen. Your attacks with your dual wield or your two-handed weapon is going to scale off of physical penetration instead. Elemental Expert increases flame, frost, shock, and magic damage. That doesn't cover physical damage. Elfborn increases your critical damage with magic ability, so that does affect your light attacks. But things like Master at Arms will also affect your light attacks because that is direct damage attacks. Staff Expert obviously won't, so you will have to use Physical Weapons Expert instead, and Thaumaturge doesn't affect it because it's not damage over time. So in terms of CPs, you are still losing out quite a bit here. You're losing out mainly on penetration. So right now, we are able to hit the spell penetration cap with our CP setup as is, but our physical penetration cap is going to be far lower. Physical penetrations, we just don't have that same amount of physical penetration, so our light attacks aren't going to do as much damage that way. Plus, we're losing 13% additional damage from Elemental Expert. This is going to be applied to staff attacks, but not our light attacks. So in terms of CB setups, you are losing a little bit of damage comparatively, but now that light and heavy attacks always scale off your highest offensive stat, that should sort of offset the big gap that we currently see on a live server for people who want to play a sort of spell sword build. What about the actual DPS difference on a dummy? So I am on a Magicka Templar, and that's mainly because Magicka Templars have traditionally been the spell swords. So way back in Homestead and One Tamriel, Magicka Templars actually did use dual wield swords because of the additional damage that we get from the dual wield passive line. So under dual wield passive line, we do get Twin Blade and Blunt, so we do get additional 3% damage done for each sword that we get. Note here that the maces don't really matter too much because that's physical penetration. The bleed from axes scale off of weapon damage and max stamina, so that's not very useful for us. And daggers increase weapon crit, and the two-handed line has the same thing on their end. So the only weapon that really makes sense for us to use is swords, because damage done is just sort of a universal buff. So we do use dual wield swords here. And so the setup that I ended up trying out first, sort of as sort of a baseline, so to speak, is Nirnhoned on the main hand with a flame damage enchant, and Precise with a shock damage enchant on the offhand. So this was the typical build that I was using as your sort of stereotypical spell sword, so to speak. And of course I did your typical double flame staff as your typical Magicka DPS. The rotation, otherwise the gear, the rotation, those all remained exactly the same here. And do note that this is not optimized yet. This was just something that I threw together in order to kind of make a comparison. The important thing here is that the only thing I changed out between my tests were the weapons. So let's go ahead and take a look at our DPS. So this right here is sort of our starting point, so to speak. So this is your double Inferno Staff build here. The main thing we're looking at on top of the DPS, so we pulled 70.3k here, is the amount of damage that we're getting from our Inferno light attacks, as well as our sustain. So remember that the changes that were made in the pre-Grimoire PTS is that light attacks restore resources according to the weapon that's being used. So staves restore magicka, martial weapons restore stamina. So a big thing here is we're going to lose a lot of magic sustain by using dual wield or two-handed compared to running double staves. So you can see here our Infernal light attacks do deal fairly decent amount of damage, 5.7k, not quite as much as it is on live. They really cut down on light attack damage, but still fairly respectable. So it's within the top 5 of our overall DPS contribution. Now in terms of sustain, our sustain is pretty good. We never drop below 50% additional max magicka here. We always stayed above 50% here. So pretty decent sustain overall, as to be expected here. And I did use Ghastly Eyeball, so that does give us both max magicka and magicka sustain as well. So this does mimic the amount of sustain that we anticipate seeing in an actual raid environment here. Now moving on to our first sort of setup here with a spell sword. So this is the dual wield sword here, again in Nirnhoned main hand with the fire damage enchant, Precise offhand with the shock damage enchant. Exact same bar setup compared to our double Inferno stave setup here. So you can see here, Puncturing Sweep, Purifying Light, Radiant Depression, Mystic Orb, Inner Light, Raising Spear, Unstable Wall, Ritual Retribution, Barb Trap, Inner Light. Bars remained exactly the same across both of these builds here, and we pulled just shy of 70k, so very, very close DPS wise. Again, this is just one parse of each, so could be RNG, crit factors involved here, so just bear that in mind when we take a look at these final DPS numbers. But based on other tests that I have seen, double staves does end up being stronger than dual wield, so these tests are fairly consistent with what I've seen with other people who have tested this out so far. Now sustain here takes an enormous hit, as we can expect here. We see we did end up dropping to 0% magicka here on 2 occasions, and I did need to light attack spam in order to get our magicka back up, and that did affect our overall DPS. You can see here, up until I ran out of magicka, our DPS total here was anywhere between 64 to about 66k, maybe up to 67 if we were lucky. Right here with our stave, we were sitting at around about the same, 64, 66, dipping to 63 here and there. So in general, the swords, if you're looking for burst DPS, is definitely probably going to be on the stronger side, but in terms of overall sustain, it's going to be difficult. We hit close to 0% here at around 2 minutes and 13 seconds. We're at 4% max magicka here before we managed to get a big jump here and sustain from our light attack spam, as well as synergies and potions here. So you can tell that sustain is going to be a big issue for a longer sustained out fight. And this is still with Ghastly Eyeball, so we are still getting about approximate raid sustain bonuses here. Now on top of sustain, our light attacks don't do quite as much damage. Again, this is scaling off of physical penetration, which we don't really have that much of. If you take a look at our stats here, we're only getting 0 physical penetration, so whatever we're hitting, they're getting the full amount of resistances. So on a trial dummy, it's only 5850, but in an actual trial boss, they're getting the full 18,200 additional physical resistance here that we're going to have to bust through. So our light attacks here with dual wield are significantly lower, 22.2k or so, just shy of that. Now, we do get some additional DPS back from running dual enchants here, so we do get some additional DPS from concussed procs, we get some additional DPS from charge compared to fiery weapon here, but not really all that much. So 1369 here compared to, if we combine these two, it's roughly speaking about 1200 or so. So not really increasing that much from our charged weapons. The main bonus here is likely coming from the fact that we are getting 6% additional damage done with our swords here. So that's really where it's making up that sort of DPS loss here from our light attacks and slightly lower enchant procs. Enchant damage here, we're just getting a lot more damage here. So if we take a look at Zahn, which is a proc set, so pretty consistent DPS, 21 213 here with double swords compared to Zahn here 21 319. Oh wait, that's not really a good example because Zahn's single target, but close enough. You can see here that with 8% additional single target from our Inferno Stave, it is getting pretty close, a little bit over what you would get with swords. Radiant Depression, for example, with double swords, 113.3k was our max hit here, compared to 107.3k here with just an Inferno Staff. So even with the additional 8% from our Inferno Staff, double swords is getting higher max hits here, at the very least with this parse here with the Radiant Depression. Now, the main concern here now is our sustain. For longer sustained fights, we're not really going to be able to maintain our DPS for very long. So I did try two other builds to try to offset our sustain. So the first build here, you can see, didn't do quite as well. Dropped quite a bit here. And what I did here was I swapped out Inner Light on the back bar for Channeled Focus. So we're losing out on about 7% additional max Magicka here, dropping our DPS on our back bar and including Channeled Focus. So we're adding an additional global cooldown, which could be used for puncturing sweeps instead. This did end up dropping our overall DPS by a substantial margin, 2.4k or so here, but we do get back our sustain. We do dip below 50%, but we're not hitting zero at all with this particular setup here. So 2.4k is quite a bit of a DPS drop, and I wasn't really going to, try to eat this. So I tried to find a different way, and so I came up with this instead, which was only about a 1k drop instead. Our sustain's not going to be quite as good. This setup here was basically an infused absorb magicka on our offhand rather than the precise shock damage enchant that we had earlier. This ended up dropping our DPS by only about 1k or so. We're still getting some damage back from the Absorb Magicka enchant. It is proc more often, so we're getting more damage out of the Absorb Magicka enchant compared to the shock damage enchant from the precise build, and we're getting some sustain out of it. Now we do end up dipping dangerously close to zero, so our low here was about 12% or so. 13-12% Magicka down at our lowest here, 10%, 8% single digits here. So we are getting very dangerously close to zero Magicka, but we never really bottomed out too much. So this is one potential way you could kind of offset that drop in sustain from running dual wield. Now, what does this mean for Spellsword builds? Well, if my tests and other people's tests are to be believed, they are going to be competitive. I won't say they're going to be the best DPS. As you can see here, we're still pulling higher DPS with the double Inferno Staves build here. And like I mentioned, other people have tested this out last week, and they did see that the double Inferno Staves was pulling out ahead to 1k DPS ahead. Now, if we were to believe those numbers, 2-3k to be typical, it's actually not terrible. It is still noticeable, so on a 70k parse, a 4k drop is about 4% DPS drop, so it's definitely noticeable. But it's still very respectable here. So again, we pulled close to 70k here with a dual wield build, and we pulled just a little bit higher, only 400, 500 DPS higher here, at least with this particular setup here, with a double Inferno Staff setup. So it is not outside of reason to believe that Spellsword builds now are going to be better equipped to deal DPS that will be able to get them those hard mode clears. This is not to say that Spellsword builds are going to be good in veteran content necessarily. So for example, Sunsparrow hard mode, that still might be a bit of a stretch for a Spellsword build, but they are definitely going to be able to compete at the very least, or at the very least meet some of those higher DPS requirements that some more higher end guilds ask for. It is still going to be a difficult challenge. You still have the stigma of running stamina weapons on a Magicka build, but it is going to be easier to meet those DPS checks now. So that pretty much concludes this video. Let me know down in the comment section below whether you want me to optimize a Spellsword build. Like I mentioned, this was not really optimized. I just sort of threw this together just to get a point of comparison, so I could better optimize this Spellsword build. Same token, the dual Inferno Saves build is also not optimized either, so I could possibly pull higher on that as well. But if you're interested in seeing an optimized Spellsword build once the Grimoire PTS goes live and we get actual confirmation that these changes will hit the live server, comment down below. I am more than willing to explore Spellsword builds, at the very least for a Magicka Templar, maybe not on all the classes, but at the very least one Spellsword build is within the realm of possibility here in the near future. But that concludes this video. Hope you guys found this informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.